I grew in that atmosphere, the atmosphere of a country which was struggling for its independence, which had the internal struggle, and which was trying to assert this independence and make the best of it. My late father, who was the chief rabbi of Ireland, was very much involved at the time, from a sympathetic point of view, with the Irish struggle for independence. President De Valera was a friend of father's. I remember him visiting us at home in Ireland, and I remember him visiting here in Israel at the beginning of the outside of state with the late Bobby Briscoe. How it all happens, we grew up in a Jewish home which was against the background of an Irish nationalist revival. And these two things combined somewhere or other in my late brother and myself. And we were nurtured by my late father on the Bible, on Jewish history, on everything that our people had gone through, and on the assumption, the clear assumption that we were ultimately going to live in, as it was then, Palestine. How or why we didn't know, but we were. And so you had these two influences bearing on me, and they've remained. I've never forgotten the Irish influence, nor did my late father, incidentally. And even my father studied Gaelic.
What kind of places do you remember in Dublin? Seaside places?
I remember Dublin. I remember Dublin quite well. Of course, I'm cheating a bit because I've been back in between. But of course, I remember where I lived. We lived first on South Circular Road and then Bloomfield Avenue. I remember us in Stephen's Green, where my school was. The Wesley College was there. In fact, I remember my primary school, which was Alexandra College, which was opposite University College. And then we used to go a lot. I used to go to Bray with my late brother, with my parents. We spent a summer, I remember, in Greystones. I went camping in Arklow, in County Wicklow. I used to go, I remember in the early days, we had a Dr. Wigater, who lived in Harcourt Street, if I'm not mistaken. He had an old Model T Ford. We used to drive to Glendalough, but spent I can recall most of the time spending, pushing it up hills, because it wouldn't go. And I remember Howth Head, we used to go out to picnic there. That's it I can recall. Then I remember once playing in Galway for some rugby match. I can't remember who it was against whom, but there was a little Jewish school, we called it Cheder, in Bloomfield Avenue. It's opposite where you have Zion schools today. Can't remember the number of the Bloomfield Avenue. That's where we had our Hebrew school until Zion School was built. Then I was confirmed in the Adelaide Road Synagogue. Father used to go every week to a different synagogue, Adelaide Road or Greenville Hall, which is up in Dolphin's Barn, I think it is. And then small ones like in Lennox Street and St. Kevin's Parade, which are in the general area of Clonbrassil Street. I don't know if they exist anymore or not. That area, of course, was immortalized from the point of view of its Jewish background by James Joyce. Mr. Bloom lived somewhere around there. I grew up in a world in which violence and internal strife seemed to be, certainly in the two areas that interested me, namely Ireland and Palestine as it was then, seemed to be part of daily life. As I say, I can recall somebody being shot on the South Circular Road when I was a tiny little boy. It's probably the first memory I've got. The beginning of sometime in the Civil War. And I remember walking down one street. I can't remember what it was. I think it was a place called Bagot Street, where seeing a place where they told me that, at least my nurse told, or the governess told me that somebody had been executed there in the war. In other words, one grew up with this story of violence. There were members of the Jewish community who helped some of the Irish resistance at the time, and their story was always told. So by and large, one grew up in a world which was not too peaceful, both physically in Ireland and mentally from the point of view of the Jewish homeland.
The Damascus Gate, the site of one of the oldest entries to a city holy to 3 religions. And after the great destruction of this city by the Romans, next year in Jerusalem became a wish and a blessing of Jews all over. It was a dream shared by the Herzog family. And that dream became a reality for young Chaim Herzog when he came to Israel for the first time in 1935 for the burial of his grandfather. That was a turning point in his career. Instead of continuing from Wesley College in Dublin with his education in Poland, he went to school here. The following year, in 1936, his father was appointed chief rabbi, and the family moved here in those days of the British Protectorate, still the Arab land of Palestine.
It certainly was a turning point in my life because I stayed here. I was a young boy, stayed here, and a year later my father was elected chief rabbi of Palestine, later of Israel, and that's how it all began.
Your father, although obviously a deeply religious man, was drawn into politics, constantly involved with the High Commissioner, trying to get more Jews into Palestine.
Well, I wouldn't call that politics from our point of view, the internal political struggle within the Jewish community and within the state after the establishment of the state. From the point of view of relations with the British mandatory authorities, there was a consensus. He was representing a national consensus. He was struggling with the High Commissioner to allow condemned refugees to enter the country, homeless refugees to enter the country, a constant struggle. He had his work cut out, trying to get people out of jail who had been arrested in the underground, trying to get them off the gallows. We went through very much a very similar struggle to what you did in Ireland, the similar problems. Maybe you didn't have the problem of immigration, but all the rest, the gallows, the jail, all the other indicators of British rule as they were at the time when the local population objected to it, they applied here just the same as they did at the time in Ireland. And he always said that, my parents always said that what they'd lived through in Ireland had prepared them in great measure for what they had to live through here.
How soon was your family conscious of the serious problem for the Jews in Europe under Hitler?
Well, my father estimated that it could happen. And he, in 1938-39, he traveled in Europe and urged the Jews to get out as soon as possible. He wrote letters to the Jewish leadership in places like Lithuania and Poland, telling them that the doom was impending and they should do something. And we have letters on file from them saying that he's exaggerating and that everything will be all right, and this is exaggerated. He at the time flew, I remember he flew in 1938 to Bucharest and Prague and so forth. And he was afterwards, during the war, he was in touch with the Vatican. He was helped a great deal in his attempts to get the Jewish children out of Europe by Cardinal Roncalli, with whom he was later Pope John the 23rd. They became very good friends. He was in Istanbul, at Istanbul at the time, Turkey. And he was of great help to my father. In fact, there was a CBS television movie about the relationship between them.
The late 30s saw you entering into your British phase, where you go to university in Britain and then, of course, join the army. How did that feel? Was it very different to Ireland?
Yes, it was. I had originally, as a little boy, planned to go to Trinity College, Dublin, like most people did at the time. In fact, we'd inquired about it and so forth. But then, while we were here, we decided that I would best go. I had an uncle in London with whom I could stay, and it would be best for me to go to college in London. I was studying at what was called here the Government of Palestine Law School, studying law. It was a school in which there were British, Arabs, and Muslims and Jews. It wasn't a bad school because you had 3 days off a week, Friday for the Muslims, Saturday for the Jews, and Sunday for the Christians. But it wasn't good enough, and at the time I'd been through a period in the underground, in the Haganah, during the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 38. I was a young boy, I was sworn in, and I just wasn't getting any studying done.
Student politics gave way to service in the British Army during World War II, an apprenticeship for his later career in the wars that established, maintained and expanded the independent Israeli state, a professional training for his future roles as head of military intelligence, military governor and commentator and historian of the Arab-Israeli wars. All very distant from the comfortable home in a Tel Aviv suburb, just as it's remote from the horrors of what happened to so many Jews in Hitler's Europe and what would happen to Palestine's refugees. World War II, when he fought at Arnhem, found his own relatives, was among the first Allied troops to cross the Rhine and helped to take Himmler into custody, was another memorable stage in Herzog's career.
I remember a short period of service in Northern Ireland, going across to Normandy, the whole push through France, liberation of Brussels, our division liberated Brussels. I went back to look for my family in Paris during that period and found my aunt. I found two aunts, as a matter of fact, in Paris, and found that one of my cousins had been, a young girl of 21, had been transported to Auschwitz and disappeared. And afterwards then I remember the break into Germany. I was with the 1st Division, which crossed the border on the west into Germany. And everything that happened in Germany, the terrifying experience of the camps, of the concentration camps, which we first met.
You were also in the group of British officers who received Himmler when he eventually surrendered.
I was in the camp, special camp which was set up. This was after the war, after the conclusion of hostilities. Special camp which was set up to try to find all the Nazi leadership. And we concentrated in that camp all the secretaries and drivers and assistants of the leadership of Germany, in order to find out exactly where we might be able to track them down. And to that camp, a man was sent who turned out to be Himmler, because he had come from Flensburg, which was then the German capital. And anybody, he came as a sergeant in the field police, secret field police, and that was already a suspect in itself, and he'd come from Flensburg, and so they decided to lock him up. Had he made himself a private in the secret field police, he wouldn't have been arrested and would have probably got away. And at some stage or other, he felt that maybe he would be recognized by the other Germans. I don't know why he did it, but he gave himself up.
How did
we had him for an hour or so, and then they came from army headquarters and took him away, where he committed suicide.
How did it feel for a Jew to see this man, of all the people in Europe?
It was terrifying, and at the same time, it was too great an event to create any immediate impression on you. You know, some things happen to people in life that are so imposing that they can't react at all. And I would say that was one of the, that was possibly the case with me. With other leaders. I met some other Nazi leaders there in the camp, including the man who caused the war actually directly, namely the Gauleiter of Danzig. But what was so terrifying was you saw just a normal human being. You expected an animal, a savage, which he was, and you suddenly saw a normal human being like yourself, like anybody else.
All of your wartime experience, of course, was good background for you in coming back here to Israel and becoming involved in the armed struggle, becoming involved in intelligence. You were quoted as saying to an Irish journalist about the end of the British protectorate that the British were here behaving like bastards, and indeed inefficient bastards at that.
Well, it was pretty terrifying at the end. When I came back, I found myself suddenly, overnight, on the other side of the barrier. Here I'd been an officer with a very considerable responsibility in northern Europe, in the German area, and then I came back and found I couldn't even enter an officers' club in Palestine at the time. That didn't bother me. Their whole attitude, the hangings, the arrests, the closing off of the areas, the real brutality in the treatment of a civilian population. This was, they'd lost their nerve. They'd lost their cool. And they were just lashing out. And you've got the best evidence of the fact is that after that they just threw in the towel. They couldn't continue and handed the whole business back to the UN.
In the last days of the British protectorate, Palestine was an occupied country. Jewish demands for a homeland had moved from prayer to action. Arab resistance increased. It was a country moving to a new and violent birth. Jewish resistance groups were ready to fight Arabs and the British, but there could be no military solution to these tensions. The Jewish refugee ship, the Exodus, became a symbol of desperation for independence. Jews driven from Europe after the horrors of the Holocaust or seeking safety from Arab lands carried all the universal marks of every refugee. Displaced persons who became the pawns of a power struggle that reached beyond their human misery. And when the Exodus was turned back by Britain, the guilt of the Holocaust stirred many consciences in the West to a new awareness of an age-old problem. On the streets of the Holy Land, the violence grew worse. That violence, marked in the bombing at the King David Hotel, bred new victims. Both Arab and Jew suffered. The closing days of the British occupation drifted into a new war with the Arab states. Palestinian Arabs, displaced by the creation of that state, announced by Ben Gurion, were to become a political running sore and a threat to Israel.
You made the point that the creation of the State of Israel made two refugee problems, an Arab and a Jew problem, that the Jewish state managed its refugees that the Arabs never have done. Is it really as simple as that?
It is as simple as that. At that time, I would estimate roughly the number of refugees created by the wars that we had was roughly in the region of 800,000 Arabs, and at the same time, the Jewish community, ancient Jewish communities who lived for over 2,000 years in these Arab countries, like in Iraq, Yemen and so forth, were driven out. And we had about 800,000 refugees from the Arab world. Now the Jewish community in Israel and the Jewish community throughout the world rallied around and settled all the Jewish refugees. At the beginning it was very, very difficult. They lived under very difficult circumstances. And today they are among the leaders of the country today, and very good leaders. And it brought them back to, literally to a normal existence. The Arabs, for their reasons, refused to do this, preferred to treat the Palestinians as pawns, which they've done all their life. And that's the tragedy of the Palestinians. They've been treated by the Arab governments as pawns. They're waking up to that now, but it took them a very long time. And the Arab world, which could have solved the entire problem for the cost of one day's supply of oil, preferred to leave them in these horrible camps and to not to solve the problem so as not to remove the problem from Israel.
Was it ever reasonable to expect Palestinian Arabs to accept an Israeli state?
It's in all political confrontations. If you don't want to compromise, you can't get very far. The tragedy of the Palestinians was that their leadership did not allow them ever to accept anything less than 100%. The Jewish policy all along was one of compromise, and therefore we've been successful so far. The Arabs was no compromise whatsoever, and therefore they failed. And you have only the recent example again of the PLO turning down the possibility of Jordan representing the Palestinians in peace talks with Israel. And it's the same pattern all along. They could have had a Palestinian state 3 or 4 times. They were offered it and we agreed to it on these occasions. And what's happened is every single time they turn it down because they're not getting 100%. Only later, after it's too late, to regret and say, I'm willing to go back and take what I turned down.
But looked at from an Arab point of view, couldn't it easily be said that you have been the aggressors, you were the people who took their land, you occupied, you were the people who launched 2 preemptive strikes against them?
No, that's not historically correct. There was an arrangement made after... I'm not talking now about the historic right of the Jewish people to this country. I'm not talking about the Bible. I'm not talking about our links. I'm not talking about what Jerusalem, for instance, means to the Jews. And you go out into any street in Ireland or elsewhere and ask any child what Jerusalem means, and he will immediately associate it with the Jewish people and with the Bible. I'm not talking about, let's put that aside, but from an international point of view, arrangements were made to set up a Jewish national home in Palestine without dispossessing the local population, without prejudice to the local Arab population. There were not many Arabs in the country at the time. And which was welcomed by some of the Arab leaders, including King Faisal at the Versailles Conference. What happened was that the Arab leadership refused to accept this over the years. And the great tragedy was that while we held out our hand for peace and were willing to coexist with them, they were unwilling to accept that hand of peace. And as a result of following the intransigent approach of their leadership, they've reached the tragic situation where they are today. As I say, they could have had a state. They were offered in 1938. The British set up the Peel Commission report, which the Jews accepted. It was going to be partition. They could have had it under the United Nations in 1947, the partition agreement. They could have had an Arab state, side by side with the Jewish state. In other words, the world recognized on every occasion that they examined the problem, including the United Nations, that the Jews had a right to a state here. The question was, how do you get together with the Arab population? The Arab population never, until this day, has never agreed to discuss peace or compromise with the Jewish people. The only person who had the courage in the Arab world to do that was President Sadat, with the results that you saw.
In 1967, after the Israeli triumph in the Six-Day War, Chaim Herzog returned to Jerusalem. It was a return that seemed to marry professional success and personal sorrow. Here on the Mount of Olives, he picked his way through the desecrated tombstones of his grandparents, desecrated during the Jordanian occupation. And that seemed an unsure foundation on which to build good Arab-Israeli relations for the man who was to become, for the first time in 2,000 years, Jewish governor of Judea and Samaria.
For yourself, 1967, of course, a high point of your own career. You're the first Jewish governor there for 2,000 years. How easy was it for you, picking your way through the tombstones that had been desecrated, the tombstones of your own people, your own family, how easy was it for you to take on that governorship?
It wasn't difficult because, number one, it was a great historic occasion, and again you were in a situation where you just couldn't comprehend the importance of these events against the background of national history of over 3,000 years. But it wasn't that difficult because the Arabs were willing to cooperate. In fact, they offered to cooperate more than I think we were prepared, and I'm sorry we weren't willing to accept it at the time. But
would you have preferred to go further in 1967 and offer autonomy, for instance?
I did suggest to our government that they be given autonomy. I spoke to the Arab leadership and suggested to our government they be given autonomy within the framework of Israeli sovereignty. And their situation, they were in such a shock after the 67 war. Remember, they, on the eve of the 67 war, intended to annihilate Israel. And they expected to do so. And a week later, they find that we've driven them out of Sinai, out of the West Bank, out of the Golan Heights, and their world has fallen apart. So they were ready psychologically for an arrangement with us. And at that time, the government of Israel on the 19th of June 1967 offered to hand back the whole of Sinai in return for peace and demilitarization, to hand back the whole of the Golan Heights in return for peace and demilitarization. I was part of a team that was preparing position papers in order to negotiate some compromise with King Hussein on the West Bank, under the direction of the government, which included Mr. Begin at that time. The Arab reply to this, under Soviet pressure at the time, but also because of their own foolhardiness, was the three no's of Khartoum, which is no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no peace with Israel. And so the tragedy continued.
Also, of course, the triumph continued for Israel, but it opened up a new can of worms, the territories, the question of settlement. You've described repeatedly, the question of settlements as a side issue. Is it really such a side issue?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a side issue, but I'd like to go back to, you asked me before about how difficult it was to be the governor. A very important thing was the Israeli attitude at the time, what General Dayan laid down as a policy. And the policy he laid down at the time was that he did not want us to interfere in the Arab life, that they're to rule themselves. We're to rule through the Arab leadership, and that we did. And as he put it to me with a smile, we're suffering enough ourselves from Israeli bureaucracy, they don't deserve it.
Matching those Arab three no's in the Khartoum Declaration, you have the Israeli no to the notion of a Palestinian state on the West Bank. Now, can you really justify that?
Oh yes, if you just have to look back at our experience. My home was under shell fire in the 1967 war from Jordanian artillery at Kalkilia, which is not far from here. In fact, if you stand there on the hill at Kalkilia, you can see this street where we are now, and we're well within range of artillery fire. The children were in a slit trench in the garden at the time. Having the area of the West Bank as an independent Palestinian state, which incidentally would be led by the PLO, which is linked to the Soviet Union, would mean that we would have the Soviet Union literally on our doorsteps here, and I'm not exaggerating. We can't take that danger would exist. We can't take that chance. Our great weakness was that we had a narrow waistline along the coast, and we're sitting here along the coast, just north of here, about 20 minutes north of here. The waistline of Israel was about 9 miles wide, and it only needed one armored thrust in order to cut Israel in half. So all of this led us to an understanding that we can't risk that ever again.
The debris of war dots the landscape of modern Israel. These are national monuments, shrines to those who died in a series of wars. Because the story of this state has been a succession of armed struggles, and in all of them, Herzog played a central part. In the original War of Independence in 1948 and 49, first against the British and then against the Arabs to maintain the new state, Herzog was director of military intelligence. In 1956, during the Sinai campaign, he was the commanding officer of the Jerusalem district. And then, in the Six-Day War, when Israel struck first, and again in the Yom Kippur War, his was the voice of Israel for his own people and for a larger world. He's reflected, written extensively of his experience during those campaigns.
And it was no easy task to justify a nation that seemed committed to living by the sword. As war followed war, Israeli victories were often balanced against the loss of political friends. In learning to stand alone, it increasingly runs the risk of being left alone and isolated.
What about Israel's lost chances? You've written in 1971 that Golda Meir perhaps missed a chance of a settlement, an early settlement with Sadat.
That was when Sadat proposed peace, and Mrs. Meir said, ironically, that will be the day. But apparently Sadat did intend peace at the time. People were just did not appreciate it. There were negotiations. General Dayan at the same time proposed peace, proposed a partial withdrawal from the Suez Canal. And the distance between them was not far. It was very tragic. And what I've said, what I've written is that had instead of Gunnar Jarring, a Swedish diplomat sent by the UN...
He was the personal representative of the Secretary General.
He was the personal representative of the Secretary General. Instead of him negotiating this, had there been a Henry Kissinger at that time, we could, in all probability, have avoided the 1973 war.
The Yom Kippur War.
The Yom Kippur War, yeah.
But you miscalculated the degree of moderation on the Arab side there. Do you miscalculate the degree of possible moderation in the PLO?
Yes, no, we don't miscalculate it. We are aware of the situation in the PLO. We're very aware of the situation in the PLO. The PLO is, it's a big there's a very big difference between the PLO and the Arab world, or even the remainder of the Palestinians. You've got to remember there's a large body of Palestinian opinion which is not necessarily in favor of the PLO. And you in Ireland can understand this better than anywhere else in the world, that not always the extremists represent the sense of the general sense of the public. Well, that's the situation today, in my view, amongst the Palestinians, amongst a great part of the Palestinians. The Palestinians live by the Palestine National Council, but Palestine National Council's statements, and by the Palestine Covenant, which calls, in effect, for the destruction of Israel in at least 3 of its paragraphs. And therefore, you're dealing here with an organization which is devoted to the destruction of Israel.
Yet there are many people who in recent times, they point, for instance, to the outright rejection of the Reagan plan as an indication of Israeli intransigence, that you're not prepared now to settle and compromise.
The fact is that we are prepared to negotiate with King Hussein any time he comes along, provided there are no preconditions. And after all, you can fault Israel on this or that, but there was only one Arab leader who had the strength and the courage to test Israel, to come forward and say, all right, I'm coming to Jerusalem, I want to negotiate with you. That was President Sadat. It was tough negotiation. In the final analysis, he got back Sinai, and we have relations, and you can get in a bus today in Tel Aviv and drive to Cairo every morning. And that happened because there was one great leader there. If King Hussein had the strength and the courage to do that now, we could also come to an arrangement, I'm sure, with Jordan on the whole Palestinian issue. Anyway, the government of Israel is prepared to do that. Each one has a different solution. The government has a different solution and the opposition has a different solution. But both the government and the opposition are prepared to negotiate.
Do you think now that internal politics within Israel itself are creating some problems of intransigence?
Internal politics, of course, lay down the various policies, definitely. But the fact is that the Arabs have not put the Israeli electorate on the spot by saying, right, we're ready to come and negotiate without any preconditions. If they did so, then internal politics would have to decide what policy to adopt. And if the Israeli public, which is an electorate which is quite a sophisticated electorate, saw that you could, following the Sadat experience, achieve something by negotiation, then I'm sure it would react accordingly.
What's your vision of Israel over the next decade? During the period of your presidency, do you see something like a creeping normalization of relations with the Arab world?
I think we're moving. I think we've passed really a watershed in the Middle East. In the past, the word Israel was a dirty word. The word peace was a dirty word. That's all over. The debate in the Arab world today is not whether or not to negotiate with Israel. The debate in the Arab world today, and this is the great revolution that has occurred, is what you get out of negotiations with Israel. Can this or that Arab leader deliver the goods? In other words, the concept of negotiating with Israel and of living with Israel in peace is no longer rejected in the Middle East. Israel is accepted. Of course, I'm not talking about the fringe, lunatic fringe like Libya, possibly Syria today. But the bulk of the moderate Arab countries recognize that the time has arrived now for the Arab world to accept Israel in the area. The question is on what conditions. That's the issue. How do you negotiate? What do you negotiate? And that's a long process, but it began with Egypt. If you look back 15 years ago, where were we? In the Six-Day War, where the word Israel was printed even in the Jordanian press in inverted commas. And today, you have a Hebrew program on television every night from Jordan in which the news about Israel is reported. It's slanted, but there's a lot of impartial reporting going on. Israel is accepted. The idea of relations with Egypt, the idea that we have embassies in each country, it's forgotten now in the Arab world. It's taken for granted. We have a free open border with Jordan across the Jordan River with 1 million people crossing in each direction every year and tens of millions of dollars worth of trade. And we're now on the eve of, I'm sure now, of a special arrangement with the Lebanese. You'll see Lebanese car license plates all over the country here, with trade growing there. In other words, I think this process is going to advance, and we've come forward a considerable way.
As you enter your presidency, as the country enters its 36th year as an independent state, how far away have you moved from the kind of vision your father had, that this would not just be an independent state, that this would represent a spiritual rescue for Judaism, a haven, he said, for the Jewish people in their bodies and souls?
Well, it's certainly been a haven for them in their bodies, and to a great degree, and to a great extent in their soul. There are a lot of aspects of Israeli society that many of us do not like. But we struggle. We live in a society in which you can struggle to improve it. We have many shortcomings. Nobody denies that in this country. We have, but at the same time, we're a country that has pulled itself up by its bootstraps. We have a free and independent judiciary. We have a democracy. No child is in want of education in this country. I think back to the days when I was at the UN and looked out and saw only 35 democracies out of 156 countries there in the UN. I thought of the misery and the poverty and the concentration camps and the gulags and all that these nations, these representatives in the UN represent. And I thought of our small country of 3.5 million with all that we've been up against and the type of the freedom of expression that we have, the multiracial society we've established despite all the problems with our Arab population, the fact that the dignity of man is a supreme value in this country, I think we've got a lot to be proud of.
And in your presidency, can we look forward to the possibility of a visit back to Ireland?
I don't think I would like anything better than to come and visit Ireland as the President of Israel, and as a president who owes a great deal in his formative years to the Irish experience. I would love to come.
Chaim Herzog, thank you.